I was looking through the YouTube chat just a moment ago, trying to catch up, make sure that I didn't miss any prayer requests, because I know that we do. And also because I just love that sense of community that's happening as the worship is happening. And one of our young people was asking the question, like, which candles are we supposed to light for Advent? I want you to know, you are not the only one to ask that question. We get that question every time we have candles, and when we ask our families to light the Advent candles. They go, now which ones exactly? Because we want to get it right, and it is great to be focused on that stuff. So this week, if you have a pink candle, we light the pink candle. And if you don't, it's fine. We just need 3 candles because this is the 3rd Sunday of Advent. And we save the middle candle, the white candle, for Christmas Eve because that's the Christ candle. And we are celebrating the birth and the presence of God in Christ on Christmas Eve. So 3 candles. If you've got a pink one, you light the pink one. And the reason there's a pink candle, for those of you who may not know, is that a long time ago, way before any of us were born, the season of Advent was actually 6 weeks long. And instead of being sort of joyful and preparing for Christmas with all the excitement that comes with what we think of as the holiday season, it was more like Lent. It was a little more reflective and somber. It was penitent. You're supposed to sort of be solemnly preparing for the birth of Christ. And the church recognized that it's hard for people to be solemn for 6 weeks, particularly when they're getting excited about Christmas. And so they celebrated 1 week of a sort of reprieve from all of the seriousness of Advent with the pink candle, the gaudete, I think is the word that they used. I think it comes from Latin. I probably got that wrong. But it means to celebrate, to be joyful, to rejoice. And it's a reminder that even as we're preparing for something celebratory. Now, of course, Advent is only 4 weeks long for most of us. Some churches do 6 weeks still. And it's less sort of somber and serious than it used to be. But we still have the pink or rose candle on this 3rd Sunday. And if you look at the readings, there's a sort of cycle of readings that gets assigned every year. These readings are usually more joyful and upbeat. They're excited. Paul writes in that letter to the Thessalonians, "Rejoice in the Lord always." So this is a Sunday of celebration and thanksgiving and joy. But this is a weird time to feel joyful, isn't it? I mean, yes, it's the holiday season, and perhaps more than any year previous, or at least for a long time, there's a real sense of the tragedies and the struggles and the heartache and the horror of the world. Just last night, people rioted in the streets of our nation's capital. They beat people up. There were stabbings. There were people who tore down banners that said Black Lives Matter and burned them in the streets, calling for white supremacy to be the rule of our nation. And we can't pretend that that's not real. And we can't turn a blind eye to the threats that are real against our brothers and sisters who have different colored skin or come from a different part of the world. And not only that, of course, we're in the midst of this pandemic, and it's worse than it ever has been. Even though we're tired of dealing with it, even though we're tired of being at home and missing out on birthdays and anniversaries and celebrations and Thanksgiving and Christmas, more people are dying every day now than they did at any point in the last 9 months. And we know, based on what we see happening with the infection rates, that there will be more people dying each day for weeks and perhaps months to come. And yes, there's a vaccine that is being distributed, and yes, there is hope, but we're not there yet. And we can't pretend like this is over. And it's not just that. It's not just people rioting in the name of white supremacy on our streets. It's not just people dying daily and losing family and friends because of this pandemic, it is also that we've exposed the reality of our world that people who are very wealthy are getting wealthier. People who are not very wealthy are losing their homes, their ability to care for themselves, their jobs. Many of them don't know where their next meal is coming from. Someone did the math about the billionaires who live in the United States. And if the billionaires got together, they could give every citizen of the United States $3,000 out of their pocket. Here's $3,000 for you. So if there's 4 people that live in your house, each of them would get $3,000. And after giving away that much money to the citizens of the 300 and something million citizens of our country, the billionaires of this nation would have still earned billions more over the course of the pandemic than they had to begin with. That's a broken, immoral system, and we cannot turn a blind eye to it. So what is there to rejoice about? It's a good question. It's tempting to close our eyes and to plug our ears and pretend like everything is normal, to find that comfort and that familiarity. And there are places, as I said last week, there are places where that's appropriate and good to be rooted in the things that do connect us with our community, with our family, with our history. That in and of itself is not bad, but we cannot turn a blind eye to the realities of our world. How can we celebrate and be joyful this season? One of the most holy parts of my job, the time when I am most aware that I stand on holy ground, is memorial services and funerals. To gather with family and friends of a beloved, lost member of the family. To stand at the threshold between life and death and life after death. And to proclaim God's faithfulness in that moment. To pray with the family and those who grieve for healing, even in the midst of the deepest ache of their hearts. But here's a thing that I had not expected about funerals and memorial services before I was a pastor, and it was how much laughter there often is. Not because people aren't sad, but because they recognize the gift of the life of the person that they have lost. And the joyful memories that bubble up, even in the midst of grief, become like yeast worked into a measure of flour. They are seeds planted in the soil of grief, and they blossom and bloom. There is always laughter at the memorial services and funerals that I've been part of. Whether I'm leading them as a pastor, whether I'm there because it's somebody I love, who's a member of my family or a friend, there's always laughter. Because God's joy comes even in the midst of grief, even in the midst of loss. Rejoice always, says Paul. Not when circumstances are easy, not when things are happy, but always rejoice in the presence of God. Because God's joy, the goodness and beauty and holiness of the presence of God comes alongside our grief. It's not either or. It is both and. We can be grieving and hurting and worried and fearful and joyful and thankful and excited. We do not have to choose. God is present in our grief, and God even brings joy amidst our grief. This passage that Kathy read for us from Isaiah, when Isaiah, on behalf of God, says, I come to proclaim the day of the Lord's favor, release of the captives and set the prisoners free, to let the blind to see and to lift up those who have been laid low, to begin to restore the people. This passage comes from a time when the people of Israel have been carted off into exile in Babylon and now have returned to their homeland. They've returned to Jerusalem, and the city is in ruins. So when Isaiah says, we will rebuild the city, we will repair the ruins, he's not speaking hypothetically. He's talking about the city that has been destroyed, that used to be the center of their spiritual, cultural lives. We will rebuild from the ruins, says Isaiah. God is with us even in the midst of that brokenness, and there is joy in that. Because God is faithful. It doesn't mean that the people couldn't grieve what they've lost when they came to see the city of Jerusalem torn down to its foundations. It means that that's not the end of the story for them. And so God's joy begins to bubble up even in the midst of that tremendous loss. There's laughter at funerals and there's joy in the work of rebuilding from the ruins. Rejoice in the Lord always, because God is faithful. We find joy in this season not because we're pretending that things aren't broken, but because we know that in this season God is with us, and that what we see in our world today is not the end of the story. The COVID pandemic will come to an end. And there are people who will never quite recover from that because they've lost so many loved ones. But God will bring healing into their lives and our lives. There are people who are going to continue to be hungry in our world, but this is not the end of the story. God is at work to reestablish something new, where a community recognizes that it must reach out and care for every single person who lives there. The economy that we have so often been told is the best in the world will be remade so that it is an economy that really is the work of all the people, not just the folks who live at the very, very top. This is the work of God's Spirit. And while none of us would want our year to be the year that we've had, there is a clarity that God is at work, moving to do a new thing in our midst. Do you see it? God is at work in our lives. And there is joy in this season, not because everything is perfect, but because God is faithful. And we are called to help to rebuild a new way of life. This morning as I got here early, I was here before the rest of our live stream crew and unlocked the back door because Charlie often comes in that door. And as I looked, I saw that there was a car parked in the parking lot. That happens quite a bit. People, neighbors, folks park because nobody else is parking here. And we're not too worried about that for the most part because it's not a problem for us. And later in the morning, I went to lock the door after Charlie got here, and I looked and I saw that there was actually somebody in the car. And I realized that this was not a car from a neighbor. This was somebody who had stopped overnight in our parking lot. Let's see, we got about 40 minutes until the live stream starts. And I thought, what would Jesus do? Normally, I don't think that. Normally, I think, what could I try and talk somebody else into doing? But in this moment, everybody else was busy, and I thought, well, I think Jesus would make this person coffee. And we got coffee. So I met a new neighbor this morning. Got to knock on the window. He was actually about to leave, and I said, hey, if you want some coffee, we got some here. And there was a real genuine moment of connection. He told me a bit of his story and asked who I was. He said, are you a neighbor that lives nearby? And I said, actually, I'm the pastor of the church. He said, oh, I thought Raven was the pastor of the church. And I said, well, yeah, Raven kind of is the pastor of the church, but me too. Oh, man, thanks. And I don't tell you that story because I want to tell you what a great job I did. I made coffee, right? I'm telling you that story because so many of you have lived that story, have reached out in so many more powerful ways than that. And the work that we do to build connections with our community matter. The reason that that guy felt he could stay in our parking lot last night was because he knew it was safe. He knew he would be welcomed here. And that didn't happen because we put up a sign. It happened because you have loved every single person who has come across our path. There is joy in this season. I hope for our friend that he has a new job. I hope that it works well for him. I hope that he's able to get back into stable housing. And I'm going to work alongside you for the day when that happens. But there is joy in this season. Not because all of our problems are solved, but because God is working alongside us to build a new kingdom, to rebuild from the ruins, to reestablish a kingdom where God's love and peace are the rule of the day, where all of God's children are welcomed with open arms. This is a season for grief, yes. This is a season for heartache, yes. This is a season for anger, yes. And this is a season for rebuilding. And this is a season for reestablishing. And this is a season for joyful resistance to a world that will tell us you cannot change the problems you face. Because we know that God is with us, and we know that God is faithful, and we know that the world that we see and experience this day is not the end of the story. This is a season of joy, brothers and sisters, because God is with us. That is the message of Christmas, more than anything else that we do. That Emmanuel, God with us, has come and is coming. And that is the good news this day. Thanks be to God. Amen.